You think? Yeah, that's kind of too much light. Just leave this fucker unplugged. Although it does leave a shadow doing this. Which lecture are we going to do? Sappho and Pindar. What about Sophocles? Hello, Sophocles.
Welcome back to lecture 11.
She's struggling.
We will continue our discussion of Greek tragedy.
Let it out.
By looking at the life and work
Sophocles.
Sophocles, the second of the three.
She's really struggling. What the hell's going on?
Athenian tragedian. We're fortunate to know more about the life of Sophocles than we do about Aeschylus' life, or at least we think we know more about Sophocles. The reliability of some of the details that we have about his life are questionable.
9.
But even so, the details that
Part
we do
6.
about him give us a picture of how Sophocles was regarded,
All right, let's get back on this.
biographically or not. He was born in 496 and he died in 406. Thus, he lived to be 90 years old. He held several important positions in Athenian political and religious life during that very long lifetime. His political and military offices included being a treasurer of Athena, an important financial responsibility, in 443 through 442 BC, and he served as one of 10 annually elected generals in 441 through 440. That was the year when the great statesman Pericles also served as a general. On the religious side, Sophocles was a priest of a local hero. Hero in the religious sense means a spirit who could help the living, spirit of a dead person who could in some way help the living. Sophocles was a priest of a local hero.
All right, that reindeer's done. Well, just to finish these reindeers. Reindeer.
Temporarily housed the sacred snake, which symbolized the god Asclepius, in his own house, which was a position of great trust in the religious side of things. After his death, Sophocles himself, we're told, was revered as a hero, and he was given the new name Jigsaw, which means the receiver, referring to his having received the snake of Asclepius into his house while the temple was being built. Now, all of these details would indicate that he was held in very high esteem and trust. We're also told by the playwright, the comic playwright Aristophanes, among others, that he was an extremely likable man, good-tempered and easygoing and easy to get along with. We have references in our sources to Sophocles' friendships with other important literary figures of 5th century Athens, such as, for instance, the historian Herodotus, who we'll talk about in a few more lectures. There are some passages in Sophocles' works, especially in the play Antigone, where he seems to quote Herodotus. Now, there's a problem with taking that as evidence the two men knew one another. Perhaps it is, but equally well, it could be that some author writing 2 or 3 centuries later compared the passage in Sophocles, the passage in Herodotus, saw that they looked alike and said, aha, these men must have came up with the idea of friendship. So whether a friendship between them,
That's right, we got this whole one over here, don't we?
or whether the similarity in their works gave rise to the story of friendship, unfortunately, we can't know.
I mean, you could know.
About Sophocles' working career. It spans the years 4
Hell yeah.
BC to 406.
Where's these other ones?
And during
Take everything over here.
Probably 123 plays total. Remember, Aeschylus wrote probably 90 total. Sophocles wrote probably 123 plays. Very unfortunately, just as with Aeschylus, only 7 of Sophocles' plays have survived. That is a terrible loss. It's even more of a handicap in our assessment of Sophocles than it is in our assessment of Aeschylus. For one thing, since Sophocles wrote more plays than Aeschylus, we have an even smaller percentage of his work left. 7 out of 123 is a pitifully small sample. Most of Sophocles' plays cannot be securely dated. We don't have secure records for when they were performed, and that makes it hard to make statements about the development of Sophocles' style. The scholars will do this all the not securely date the plays. It's also hard to make comments about their relationship to contemporary events, the way I did with the Oresteia in the last lecture. We don't have a secure date for most of Sophocles' surviving plays, so we can't tie them to contemporary events in the same way. However, the one bit of good news is that since Sophocles seems to have abandoned the trilogy form, unlike Aeschylus, he did not write unified trilogies on a single theme. That means that we can cross-house an individual play in isolation in a way that is much more difficult to do with Aeschylus. Imagine, for instance,
Yeah, there goes the box.
had not survived and we had only Agamemnon. We could not really assess what Aeschylus was doing with themes of vengeance and contradictory duties and so forth. So clearly sets up in Agamemnon if we did not have libation bearers and Eumenides to let us see those themes develop. So with Aeschylus, when we have only one play out of the trilogy, we are in a great handicap in analyzing that play, as is the situation with the other surviving plays of Aeschylus. With Sophocles, since he wrote self-contained plays and not continuous trilogies, we can talk with a bit more safety about the plays as
Definitely.
Within even just the 7 plays that we have left of Sophocles' work, we can note some characteristic Sophoclean elements, some ways in which he differs both from Aeschylus before him and from Euripides, we'll talk about in the next lecture. Sophocles concentrates more on the individual than Aeschylus did. He pays more attention to the main individual character in his plays. And in addition, the gods in Sophocles' plays are remote and unreachable.
Don't be talking trash.
Athena, who takes part in the
Don't you be talking trash to me.
The gods in Sophocles' plays are, for the most part, remote and unreachable. Athena does appear as a character in the play Ajax, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. But far more than Aeschylus,
Hell yeah.
Sophocles focuses the audience's attention on the human elements of the stories he tells, on the human condition, without the direct intervention of gods even to help or to hinder us. Now, in Sophocles' seven extant plays, all but one is named for the main character, the individual main character. There's one of Sophocles' plays, Procynea, the Women of Trachis, which is named for its chorus. But the other 6 surviving plays, Ajax, Antigone, Electra, Oedipus the King, Oedipus at Colonus, and Philoctetes, all 6 of those are named for their protagonists, for their main characters. And these protagonists, all 6 of them, are characterized by a kind of, well, it could be called heroic or splendid isolation. The great scholar and critic Bernard Knox points out that the plots of these 6 plays all fit a basic pattern. We don't know how many of Sophocles' other plays would have fit the same pattern, but these 6 do. The main character, Antigone, Ajax, Electra, whoever, is faced with a crisis in which disaster can only be averted by a compromise that, in that protagonist's view, would constitute betrayal of something that the protagonist holds to be supremely important. For instance, in the play Antigone, Antigone is faced with the decree by her uncle, the king Creon, that she must not bury the body of her dead brother. She chooses to go ahead and bury his body anyway, in part because, as you'll remember from the lecture on the Iliad, an unburied body means that the soul cannot go into the underworld. And so Antigone, remember Patroclus came as a ghost to Achilles and said, please give my body burial. Antigone chooses to bury her brother, despite the fact that the king has decreed death for anyone who buries this man, because she cannot leave her brother's soul to wander forever. So the only way disaster could have been averted would be for Antigone to compromise her principles and leave her brother unburied. So that's the first element in the pattern that Knox identifies in Sophocles' plays. The main character is faced with a crisis. Disaster can only be averted if the main character will compromise or betray his or her principles, and he or she. The protagonist refuses to compromise, in fact, despite being urged to by persuasive speeches. To use Antigone as an example again, her sister Ismene tries to persuade her to go along with the decree of the king. The 7 surviving plays. Now, Aeschylus's characters, Agamemnon and Orestes, for instance, are often confronted with crises or dilemmas as well. There's no question about that, and I talked about that at some length in the last lecture. However, in Aeschylus's extant work, at least, I always have to say that, we don't know what Aeschylus may have done.
Thanks, buddy.
But in Aeschylus's extant work, the protagonist is not offered a way out. Neither Agamemnon nor Orestes has any middle course. Orestes can't sort of avenge his father's death and sort of kill his mother, or vice versa. He has to choose one course or the other. And Agamemnon, similarly, either has to kill Iphigenia and sail to Troy, or spare Iphigenia and not sail to Troy. There isn't any compromise. There isn't any middle way. Aeschylus, at least in the Oresteia, focuses on people caught between irreconcilable duties without a possibility of compromise. Now, this in itself certainly portrays human beings struggling under terrible circumstances, but it doesn't foreground the self-chosen or self-imposed isolation of those characters the way Sophocles' plays do. In other words, Aeschylus's characters may be isolated and tormented through the force of circumstance, but Sophocles' characters choose and maintain their own isolation through their resistance, their refusal to compromise, their resistance to both pleas and threats. Now, whether this is indicative of admirable integrity or bullheaded stubbornness is very much a matter of opinion, and different people will interpret Sophocles' main characters in different ways. This pattern of the isolated protagonist is already observable in Ajax, which most scholars think is Sophocles' earliest extant play. Ajax probably dates to sometime in the 440s, though we cannot clearly and definitely date it. In Ajax, Sophocles dramatized the story of the suicide of the hero Ajax, who was a warrior in the Trojan War. The background story is quite simple. Ajax was the second greatest Greek warrior in the Trojan War.
Why is this thing dying over here?
And only to Achilles. And when Achilles withdrew from battle, Ajax became the foremost warrior among the Greeks. He's referred to as their bulwark in the Iliad. He protects them in a very, very memorable scene. When the Trojans have reached the Greek ships, have set the ships on fire.
Can't finish, can you? What's going on there, buddy?
Fire in the Iliad.
You dying?
Most of the Greek army is demoralized. Ajax is described as leaping to the deck of one ship to another, single-handedly, basically holding off the whole Trojan army almost on his own.
This looks like a face.
Ajax is a very, very great warrior. After Achilles' death, the Greeks had to decide who should be awarded Achilles'
See if I can grab this damn box. No, I don't know if I'm going to be able to grab it.
And again, in the system of command,
Come here.
in the lecture on Iliad, the gift of Achilles' armor is an indication of which warrior is now the highest esteem, which would have been Achilles.
I don't think there's any more pieces back there.
Achilles' armor were Ajax and Odysseus. So the question was, which do the Greeks prize more highly? Ajax's prowess in battle, his courage, his defense of them, or Odysseus' skill in
Box again.
trickiness and craftiness and quick thinking? The vote went for Odysseus.
How's this piece go?
And in shame over
All right,
what
it's
he
probably
saw
going
as
right
the
over
rising
there,
of
but
honor,
that's there.
Ajax committed suicide.
Where the
So
frick
that's
are
the
these?
background story. Homer knows of this story because
This is
in
upside down.
this underworld of the Odyssey, Odysseus sees and speaks to the soul of Ajax and says, "I wish I had never taken
He's
that armor
complete.
had I known that
He
it would
looks
cost your
complete.
life. I wouldn't have wanted it." Begs Ajax to speak
That one's
to him.
complete,
Ajax
for sure.
walks by him in silence. So Ajax's resentment over this affront to
The
his
hell
honor
kind of
carries
piece
on
is this
into
then?
the afterlife. Now, Sophocles takes this basic storyline
Unless it goes there.
and he focuses on
It's gotta go there.
Ajax's reaction to the loss
Where else
of
could
the
it go?
armor. In Sophocles' treatment, Ajax is
There you
driven
go.
mad directly
There you go, buddy.
Remember, is Odysseus' patron. In his madness, Ajax sets out to kill the other members of the Greek army. He sets out to kill his fellow soldiers because they've dishonored him by giving Achilles' armor to Odysseus. But in his madness, he slaughters sheep, thinking that they are his fellow soldiers. He takes other sheep captive and lodges them in his tent. When Ajax
Yeah, I've already heard this one.
returns to his senses, he's over.
Nope. Why don't we just go to the next one, period?
From the treatment of this story and other authors. Homer, for instance, as I've already... Now, Ajax's character...
Euripides. Fear that I'm.
Hello and welcome back to Lecture 12, in which we'll finish our discussion of
Which
tragedy
is
by looking at
a tragedy in
the
itself.
third great tragedian, Euripides. Euripides was born around 480 BC and died in 406, just shortly before the death of Sophocles. So Aeschylus died in 456. Sophocles and Euripides both died 50 years later in 406. We don't know very much at all about Euripides' life. We do know that he first entered plays into competition in 455 when he was about 25 years old and placed third in that first competition.
Listen to this one too.
Victory, his first place prize, came in 441, and during his lifetime, the picture of divinity. Now, the nature of the gods.
That's over. Well, screw you too. Yeah, Euripides was the last one. All right, you're done. See which one's next. Herodotus. Do we really want to hear about Herodotus? I think we do. I think we have no choice. Disc 3. Play. All right, let's see if we can get this one. Then we move on to the blues because I can't see any place else where this is going to work except right there. Right there? Yeah. All right, I think we're done with all those maybe pink pieces. Whatever that color there. Nope, we got one more. Where the hell does it go? Right there. It's got to. Got to, buddy. He says no. He says no. So it's got to go here then. Hell yeah. Any more pink? Any more pink?
These lectures are titled Great Authors of the Western Literary Tradition, Part 2, Literature of the Classical World.
Any more pinkish? I see no more. What's this? Is that green? Greeny? Gotta find one tip to something. Tip. A tip. Is there a tip somewhere? Get out of my way. Get out of my way, boy. Oh, wait, we got another one. You gonna play? Play this son bitch. Herodotus. Please. Nope, I think that's going to start it back over. Son of a bitch. Might go there. It might not go there. It might go there for sure. All right, we've got another pink piece. Starting over again, so I'll go to this instead. No. Let it play out. Where'd I put that piece? Right there? No. Where the hell are you? Right there? Yeah.
These lectures are titled Western Literary Tradition.
Nope.
Part 2. Literature of the Classical World.
All right, we got the menu. Play 13. Nope, it's going to start over again. You fucker. Nope. One more piece of pink. Yes, maybe. I think so. Where shall it go? We're going to start all over again. Nice. Where can this go? Maybe right there? No. Not there either. Not there either. Got that. Got that. There's a little pink over there, but that ain't what we're looking for. It's got to be up here somewhere. Right there. There's another piece too. How about this? How about you go right there? They're going to say no, though. Right there? Right here, down on the bottom? That sounds like a yes. Please? No. No. Yes. See if we can find some more pink in there. I think I totally stopped it now. Let's get to these pieces. What antlers are left on the blue? This? Yes. What other?
These lectures are titled Great Authors of the Western Literary Tradition. Part 2. Literature of the Classical World.
Where does this go? Think we can push the right button this time? Oh, we did it.
Hello, and welcome to Lecture 13,
Hi.
in which we're going to continue our consideration of the
That looks like Charlie Brown Stripe time.
Athens by turning to the first great prose narrative in Western literature, the histories of Herodotus. The works we've been looking at before this point have all been in poetry. The Homeric epics, Greek tragedy, lyric poets, all of those are written in verse. With Herodotus, we turn to the development of prose in the Western narrative tradition. Herodotus is often referred to as the father of history because he was the first Greek writer to take events of the recent human past as his primary subject, and very importantly, to try to explain the causes of those events. And so that makes him, in many people's estimation, the first true historian in the Western Rhodos, a town that today is called Bozerum. But though he was born in what we would call Turkey, he was ethnically Greek, Greek-speaking. This was an area that was under Persian domination at the time of his birth, but that was Greek culturally, ethnically, religiously, and linguistically.
The fuck is this?
Ancient tradition tells us that
Where did this
Herodotus
piece
was
come
born
from?
in 484 BC, and he probably died sometime in the 420s.
This is some bitch.
We know very little about his life.
It's gonna go up there, I think.
Tells us that he traveled widely. His work certainly seems to reflect this. He spent some time, we don't know exactly how long, in Athens, but clearly he was there for part of his life. And he probably died in the Greek colony of Thurii in southern Italy. We also don't know when Herodotus began writing. His book was probably published sometime in the 420s BC, but we don't know the exact date when he finished his work and published it. His main topic was the Greco-Persian Wars of 490 and 480 through 479 BC. So he was writing about events that occurred some 60 years or so before the probable date of his publication. Herodotus does much, much more than simply recount the course of the Persian Wars of a couple of generations back. He sees the Greco-Persian conflict of 490 and 480 as part of a larger pattern of East-West conflict, or in Greek terms, European-Asian conflict, Asia referring to what we would call Asia Minor. And so he sets his account of the Persian Wars
Where's this
in
gonna
the
go?
whole history of East-West conflict, stretching all the way back to the Trojan War as memorialized in the Homeric epics. And so, to set the background for his discussion of the Persian Wars, Herodotus describes several different ancient cultures and traces the courses of events many hundreds of years before his own day and before the subject matter that he wants to focus in on. Now, the Persian Wars, Herodotus' main subject, and for that matter, Herodotus is our main source on the Persian Wars. The Persian Wars were fought in 2 episodes, 10 years apart, as I mentioned very briefly in passing in the lecture on Aeschylus, who you'll remember fought at Marathon. The first Persian invasion of 490 BC under the Persian king Darius ended with the Athenians' victory at the Battle of Marathon, in which Aeschylus took part. The second Persian invasion of Greece, a much, much larger one, took place 10 years later when Darius' son Xerxes invaded Greece in 480. And this second Persian invasion of Greece ended with the united Greek forces' defeat of the Persians, final defeat of the Persians in 479 BC. Now, the defeat of the Great Persian Empire.
All right, so there's that. Those eyes go there.
Astonishing event. If you look at a map, you can see how vast the Persian Empire was.
Got antlers here.
And how tiny Greece was. I like to say, and it's a bit of an exaggeration, but not all that much of one, that this is as though Luxembourg had defeated the Soviet Union. It was an absolutely astonishing thing. The Persians could not possibly have expected
That don't go on there, does it?
Greece. It was all the more astonishing because Greece was in no sense a unified country at this period. We talk about Greece as a kind of convenient shorthand, but actually at this time period, Greece was a conglomeration of independently governed, sometimes fiercely independently governed city-states. There was no country, no unified nation of Greece. There were Athens, Sparta, and all the other independent city-states. Athens played a crucial role in both Persian wars, both in the Battle of Marathon in 490 and in the Battle of Salamis in 480. And in fact, Athens' contribution
we want to go with those.
Persia led to Athens' growing hegemony, Athens' growing position of power in Greece during the 5th century BC. After the Persian defeat in 479, after the defeat of the Persians in 479, Athens formed a mutual defense league with various other Greek city-states that was called the Delian League. We know with hindsight that the Persians never came back, but in 479 it can't have been at all obvious that they wouldn't come back. And so understandably enough, Athens and various other city-states, particularly the island states between mainly Greece and the area of Persian dominance, formed a mutual defensive league called the Delian League. But as the 5th century progressed, the Delian League became more de facto an Athenian empire. As the Persian threat receded with the passage of time, Athens became, in effect, the head of an empire, the contributions that the other members of the Delian League had made to mutual defense became, in effect, tribute paid to Athens.
There's this
And
little
it was in
slice.
some part the
Right
money
there.
from the Delian League that led to the great cultural flowering
Another
of Athens
pink.
in the 5th century BC, the building of the Parthenon under the leader Pericles, for instance. These things were funded by money from the Delian League. So the Persian Wars led quite directly to Athens' position of political hegemony and to her cultural flowering in the 5th century. And that means we can see the Persian Wars both as the subject of Herodotus' work and as a necessary catalyst for his writing. If Athens had not been the intellectual and cultural in the 5th century, Herodotus probably would not have spent time there, probably wouldn't have written as he did. Also, by the time Herodotus came to write his histories, Athens was involved in another war, this time with another Greek city-state, Sparta. Athens and her allies on one side were at war with Sparta and her allies on the other side by the end of the 5th century. This was the Peloponnesian War of 431 through 404 BC. And we'll talk more about that in the next lecture when we turn to Thucydides, who wrote a history of that war. As I said already, we don't know the exact date that Herodotus published the histories, but scholars generally agree that he lived and wrote well into the 420s BC. And this is significant because the Peloponnesian War began in 431. So if Herodotus is writing in the 420s, that war is already well underway. And it's quite possible that at least one motivation for his writing was to try to remind the warring Athenians and Spartans of the time when they had worked together to repel a foreign invader, to try to remind them that there had been a time when these two city-states, far from being at war with one another, had stood shoulder to shoulder to defeat the Persians. Now, Herodotus' primary purpose, as he tells us in his opening sentence, which I'll go through in some detail near the end of this lecture, was to record and explain the events of the Persian War. But to do that, he needed to explore the background of that war. Unlike Homer, who could begin in medias res, in the middle of the story, Homer could begin in the middle of the story, but Herodotus had to give a great deal of background. Homer could assume that his audience already
Another piece with
the
a
background
little
story of
tip.
the Trojan War. That's taken for granted. Homer doesn't tell us about the abduction of
How'd
Helen
the other
by
one go
Paris. He
right there?
doesn't fill us in on the background. He assumes we know that. He zeroes in on the anger of Achilles. Herodotus, however, has to give his readers information about the rise of the Persian Empire and, for that matter, the rise and political development of the most important Greek city-states, Athens and Sparta. He can take some amount of knowledge about Athens and Sparta for granted in his audience, but when it comes to the Persians, he has to give us a pretty full background.
Got little deer here. They're done.
Its position of dominance. He can't assume that his audience already knows all that, as Homer could assume for his work. So Herodotus finds it necessary in describing how the Persians came into their position of power to first describe many of the other cultures that the Persians had encountered, other great empires that they had come in contact with and had conquered in order to set up their position of power when they come face to face with Greece. And Herodotus' descriptions of other cultures, such as Egypt, he devotes one whole book of his work to a description of Egypt, are sometimes called digressions by modern scholars. Herodotus is supposedly full of digressions on Egypt, on Scythia, on other ancient cultures. But that is a modern critical term.
Right, if there's eyes, they gotta be somewhere. God damn it.
Herodotus referred to the various components of his work as logoi, the plural of logos, which among other things
Maybe they aren't eyes, they're just antlers.
Story. And there's no reason to think that he considered some of his logoi less relevant than others to his overall purpose. Some modern readers working from modern standards of historiography see the digressions as deviations from the overall narrative pattern, but Herodotus himself, I think, would probably disagree with that assessment. To explain Persia and the nature of its threat to Greece, he needed to examine other empires of the past and explain their encounters with the Persians. And examining the customs and governments of other cultures and their interactions with the Persians on the one hand and the Greeks on the other hand
No.
underlines the overall pattern of East-West conflict,
No.
which is the main focus of Herodotus' work. Because Herodotus attempted to trace the causes of the Persian Wars as far back as he possibly could, he includes in his narrative matters that modern historians would consider legendary or mythic, such as, for instance, the Trojan War and many, many other things as well, talking about other cultures. He will include material that we would classify as legend or as myth. And this has sometimes been taken as evidence that Herodotus himself was naive or was incapable of evaluating his sources, didn't understand the difference between mythic events and actual events in his own time. I think this is an anachronistic assumption. I think it's anachronistic to expect Herodotus to make the same kind of distinction between myth and history that we do for a couple of reasons. First of all, Herodotus was writing at a time when literacy was fairly new. And that means his primary source material had to be, generally speaking, oral tradition. He did use some written sources, we know that, we can tell that from his work, but most of his sources had to be oral tradition, orally recounted stories, because there was nothing else. There were no other sources for him to turn to. And he himself tells us that he depended heavily on information gathered orally. He often uses terms such as "it is said," or "people say," or "they," the group of people I was talking to, told me. Material preserved in oral tradition tends to be preserved in story form. That's how oral tradition works. You remember the great leaders, the great events of the past by making them into interesting, easily memorizable, and memorable stories. In other words, oral tradition tends to work through narrative that we would be likely to classify as myth, or at least as legend. The question of whether Herodotus himself distinguished between myth and history as categories of explanation is still fiercely debated by scholars. As I said just a couple of moments ago, I think it's an anachronistic way of framing the question at all, but it is a question: did Herodotus distinguish between myth and history? That is still a matter of pretty fierce debate among Herodotean scholars. Part of the problem is that when Herodotus wrote, the Greek language had no word corresponding to either myth or history. There was no word for myth in Greek at this point. There was no word for history in Greek at this point. And so thus it seems quite clear that Herodotus doesn't make a terminological distinction. He can't distinguish terminologically if there are no terms to use. Along with most of his contemporaries also, Herodotus did not doubt that the famous characters of Greek tradition had really lived. We say that Agamemnon, Achilles, and the rest of the heroes of the Trojan War are mythical heroes. That is, we don't think they ever actually lived. Herodotus thought they had lived, but in this he was no more naive than any other 5th century Greek. All Greeks at the time assumed that these great heroes of the Trojan War had really lived in the remote past, in the 12th century BC.
Colors
The
that green.
details of their stories might be disputed, but their actual existence was taken for granted as
Green.
So Herodotus doesn't seem to distinguish between myth and history as types of narrative. He wouldn't say, in these chapters where I'm talking about the Trojan War, I'm writing myth, and these later chapters where I'm talking about the Persian War, I'm writing history. But most scholars now agree, I think it's safe to say most now agree, that he does make a chronological distinction. And this is a point I want to stress because I think it shows us just how skillful and careful a thinker he was. He does make a chronological distinction between the remote past and the recent past, between what we would call mythic time frame and what we would call the modern time frame. He makes a distinction between the remote past and the recent past, not in terms of type of narrative, but in terms of verifiability. And let me explain what I mean by that. Herodotus certainly does not exclude the remote past from his account. For instance, when he discusses the beginnings of the enmity between Europeans and Asians, between Westerners and Easterners, he refers all the way back to the stories of the Trojan War. Naturally enough, from his viewpoint, that's when East again. But he clearly delineates the boundaries of his main subject, very near the opening of his work, by saying that he will start his narrative proper, that he will really get into the meat of his narrative with the man whom, as he puts it, I myself know to have been the first foreigner to wrong the Greeks.
Right there.
Now, in this phrase, when he says, I'm going to talk about the man whom I myself know was the first foreigner to wrong the Greeks, he makes it very clear that he's talking about Croesus, a king of Lydia, another area in modern-day Turkey, who ruled from around 560 to 546 BC. Now, that means, if you think about the dates, if Herodotus is writing in the 420s, and Croesus ruled from around 560 to 546, Herodotus is writing about someone who lived and ruled about 140 years, if we take the 560 date, before Herodotus' own time. This is right at the outer limits of the time period that scholars of oral tradition call three-generation reachback. What's meant by three-generation reachback is that the historian, the recorder of oral history, can talk to someone who talked to someone who was an eyewitness. Let me very quickly give you a personal example of how that works. In the summer of 2001, I attended a conference
Is that right?
on
I don't think so.
World War I and its impact on the 20th century in Northampton, England. The keynote speaker of that conference in 2001 was a British veteran of the Western Front. And so I knelt at the feet of, held the hand, and talked to a man who had fought in France in 1917. If we fast forward to the 2040s, when I will be in my 80s, and imagine some young historian talking to me, that person in 2040 will be talking to someone who talked to someone who fought in World War I. That's three-generation reachback. And about as far as you can push it is exactly as far as Herodotus does push it, about 140 years. That, I think, is what he means by saying Croesus is the first man of whom he knows who wronged the Greeks. So Herodotus pretty clearly, I think, distinguishes between accounts set in verifiable time, accounts set in time, a time period where you can talk to someone who talked to someone who was there, and accounts that are further back than that are beyond the reach of that kind of three-generation memory. Organizationally speaking, Herodotus' histories consist of 9 books. Despite the vast amount of material contained in the text, its organization moves clearly towards its culmination in the account of Greece's victory over Persia. The first 3 books, the first 3 papyrus rolls of this 9-book set the context by recounting the ancient roots of
Kind of want to just do the
Greece's
black ones
and the rise of Persia.
since there's a large black spot there, but that may not be feasible. Oh, look, this has a little blue. That has a little blue. That has a little blue.
And the rise of the Persian Empire under Cyrus. Book 2 focuses on Egypt, which Cyrus's son Cambyses added to the Persian Empire, and Book 3 concentrates on the accession
Looks like it goes.
of Cambyses' successor Darius. The next 3 books examine the campaigns of Darius, first against other cultures, then against the Athenians in 490. Book 4 looks at Darius' campaigns against Scythia and Libya. Book 5 describes the revolt of the Greek-speaking Ionian city-states from Persian rule in the 490s. Athens helped the Ionian revolt. That was what caused Darius' enmity against Athens. Those of you who have read Herodotus will remember that he tells us Darius had a slave stand behind him and whisper in his ear at dinner, "Sire, remember the Athenians," to keep his desire for vengeance alive. Book 6 begins the narrative of the Persian Wars themselves by describing Darius' invasion of Greece and his troops' defeat at the Battle of Marathon. And then in books 7 through 9, the histories culminate in the description of the second Persian invasion of Greece under Xerxes, Darius' son. Book 7 describes Xerxes' preparations and journey to Greece and includes the narrative of the Battle of Thermopylae, that extremely famous last stand of the 300 Spartan warriors in the narrow pass, trying to hold off the whole many thousand strong Persian army from getting into Greece, the Battle of Thermopylae, which was a defeat for the Spartans, but one of those glorious defeats that is in some ways more memorable than most victories. controversial naval battle of Salamis, and Book 9 concludes the histories by describing the Persians' eventual defeat at the battles of Judea and Mytilene. And so the overall pattern of the histories is clear, a narrowing down from a broad, really in Herodotus' view, worldwide picture of great empires and their conflict with one another, down to the Persian Empire and its rise under Cyrus, Cambyses, and Darius, down to the invasion of Greece, finally onto Xerxes' second invasion of Greece, and the details of the battles that were fought in that war. So Herodotus works from a broad overall portrait of foreign cultures in the remote past into a detailed and vivid description of the Persian wars. It's really quite beautifully organized.
See if I can get the legs.
Herodotus' achievement, both in arriving at the idea of his work and in bringing it to fruition, is absolutely astonishing. I just described the organization and said it's a beautiful achievement. It's also one that we cannot comprehend how he managed. How did he take notes? He didn't have a laptop.
That's going to go into...
He didn't have index cards and a ballpoint pen. How did he organize his material in his mind? How did he remember it? How did he write it using papyrus and ancient writing materials? We don't know. We know that he did.
Possibly here.
But the accomplishment is absolutely astonishing one. In his opening sentence, Herodotus tells us his motivations. This sentence gives us insight
Where can we see some feet?
and his achievement, and the opening sentence of the work also delineates how Herodotus
Can't go there.
differed really from
Right
anything
there?
that had preceded
Yes.
it. And I want to turn now to looking in some detail at the opening sentence of Herodotus' work. In Aubrey de Selincourt's translation, the sentence reads, Herodotus of Halicarnassus here displays his inquiry, so that human achievements may not become forgotten in time, and great and marvelous deeds, some displayed by Greeks, some by barbarians, may not be without their glory, and especially to show why the two peoples fought with one another. Now, almost every word of that sentence repays careful consideration, and I could go on and on about every single word of it. But in the time I have left in this lecture, I can only look at the absolute key points of this sentence. The first word to note is actually the third word of the Greek sentence, historiae. The Greek reads,
Alright, so that's definitely a leg there.
Historiae display this is, more or less. Historiae is clearly the word from which we get history. But in Herodotus' usage, in the Greek of his day, it means inquiry or research, and that's how de Selincourt translates it. Herodotus of Halicarnassus here displays his inquiry. Herodotus says that he is setting out, he's setting forth, he's displaying his historiae, his inquiry or his research, telling his audience, in other words, what he found out by inquiry. I went around asking people things, and this is what they told me. Because Herodotus' work was a new kind of writing, nobody had done exactly this before. There was no genre term for it.
So we
Nobody
need
could
some
say
more little
Herodotus just wrote a new
flex.
There wasn't a word for it. His work was so important and was so influential that
those are all done. It's got to go up here then.
Came very quickly to mean history in our sense. This is the display of the history of Herodotus. Some modern translators will translate it that way. It's very tempting to do so. It's also very misleading because Herodotus does not say, I'm writing history. There was no word for that. He gives us both the genre and the word to describe it.
Nope, this is antlers.
The second bit I want to concentrate on is human achievements. Herodotus here displays his inquiries.
Antlers. Right there?
Not become forgotten in time.
No.
Achievements translates the Greek phrase "tagenomena ex anthropos,"
Fuck are the antlers?
which literally means the things that have come about
Up
from
here.
human beings. That's a literal though awkward translation. The things that have come about from or
Is that it?
because
No.
of human beings. This is an
Or is
important
it?
delineation of Herodotus'
I don't think so.
He's interested in what
Don't think
humans
so,
do
bruv.
and what humans accomplish. Human achievement, not divine achievement, not the divine will, but what humans do. And his main concern is to keep these things that have come about from human beings from growing faded through the passage of time. The word that
Right there.
Selincourt translates rather as forgotten literally means faded, a word that's used about paintings, so that the
Definitely antlers.
narrows cognomina down by specifying that Herodotus is concerned with erga megala tekaithalista, great and astonishing erga. Now the word erga can mean both works and
Don't know.
deeds. So Herodotus here is allowing himself room to talk about great monuments, the pyramids of Egypt, the walls of Babylon, as well as great human deeds, the battles of Thermopylae and Salamis. So again, the things that have come about for human beings include both the monuments we leave behind us and the deeds that we accomplish. And he says that he wants to recount the deeds and achievements of both Greeks and foreigners. Selincourt translates the Greek word barbaroi as barbarians. That is very, very tempting. Again, it's obviously where our word barbarian comes from, but in Herodotus' usage, it simply means foreigner. In fact, it means non-Greek speaker. It's originally
All right, there's the other foot.
word, believe it or not. A barbaros is someone who says bar instead of speaking Greek. It's
Barbarossa?
like babble. So it originally means babblers, non-Greek speakers, foreigners. Herodotus is by no means trying to claim that the great Persian Empire consists of barbarians in the sense of savages. He's not saying that at all. He's saying foreigners. And his purpose in recording these human achievements is to prevent them from becoming akleia, without glory. Think back to the lecture I gave you.
Where's this son bitch right there?
How the Homeric warrior fights for kleos, eternal glory, imperishable fame. Herodotus here says, I want to keep these achievements of human beings from losing their kleos, from becoming akleia.
No.
Herodotus is thus, if you think about it, claiming for himself a commemorative function similar to Homer's, which is a rather, cheeky thing to do. To say, here I am, I'm providing for the Persian Wars the same kind of memorialization that Homer provided in epic. Now, up to this point, Herodotus has presented two reasons for setting out his inquiry: to keep noteworthy events from being forgotten, and to keep human achievements from losing their glory.
Gotta go on one of these.
At this point, he hasn't done anything so very new. This is what Homer did: memorialize achievements, preserve the kleos of those who
Blue into blue.
But the last clause of the sentence is in some ways the most important of all. Here Herodotus says that he wants to record through what cause, and the Greek word is itia, the two sides, Greeks and foreigners, warred with one another. This is the point, I think, at which Herodotus truly breaks new ground. In his stated desire not simply to list events, but to explain the reasons for the conflicts between Greeks and Persians. Now, Homeric epic had definitely given reasons for individual human actions, but the wider sweeping causes were attributed to the gods. The opening lines of the Iliad cite the boule Theos, the will of Zeus. The germ of true historiography
There you go, bastard.
lies in Herodotus' stated attempt and intention, however imperfect his achievement might be, to explain rationally and
Right,
through
this looks like an ear.
argumentation why things happened as and when they did in human terms. Like any pioneer,
Where's these eyeballs
he
too?
doesn't manage to create a new discipline.
I do with the
something
eyeballs.
consistent out of thin air. He owed a great deal to previous modes of thinking and of literature, and in particular to Homer. He
I believe those eyeballs are over there.
the gods entirely. He will list
Although,
what he thinks the gods wanted as causes for events. But the gods
no, that's got to be these.
in Herodotus' work,
It's got to be these eyeballs, right?
Instead, he focuses on human actions,
Flat top.
and responsibility. When he cites a god,
Plus it's these eyeballs. Oh, these are the biggest ones. They gotta go up here. Gotta go there.
Though Herodotus may not have been a fully fledged historian with all the critical resources of the modern historian at his beck and call, his approach to narrating the past provided a crucial foundation.
Unless they go over here. No, there's the eyeballs there.
And in the next lecture, we'll look at Herodotus' first great successor, Thucydides. Welcome back to Lecture 14, in which we will continue our discussion of 5th century historiography by looking at the work of Herodotus' successors, conflicts between Athens and Sparta that we call the Peloponnesian War. This war began in 431 and ended with Athens' defeat by Sparta in 404. The Peloponnesian War was the culmination of antagonism between Athens and Sparta and their allies on either side, which had built up throughout the middle of the 5th century BC. The history of this war is extraordinarily complex. I can only give a very, very brief summary and outline sketch of it here. The first 10 years of the war, 431 to 421, are often called the Archidemian War. Thucydides himself calls this
because it goes up there, you dumbass.
Seems to consider it separate
Just don't see the other eyeballs.
It did end with a peace treaty, but the treaty did not hold for any significant time at all. The overall Peloponnesian War, and again, most modern historians count
Right, where's this antlers up here?
404 as really one long war. The war began with a quarrel between Athens and Corinth. Corinth, as a Peloponnesian city-state, that is, as a city-state in the part of Greece in which Sparta is also located, was allied with
I
Sparta.
don't fit there.
And so when Corinth and Athens became open enemies, enmity between Athens and Sparta could not be and was not far behind. There seems to have been strong pro-Sparta feeling among many Greek city-states that disliked Athens' growing power throughout the 5th century. War was openly declared in 431, and the Spartans invaded Attica, the region of Greece in which Athens is located. The early years of the war included plague in Athens in 430, 429, and
could be a foot too. No, it's definitely
historians still disagree about what exactly this plague was. It doesn't seem to fit exactly any of the descriptions of known diseases that we have, but whatever it was usually fatal and devastating. The great statesman Pericles was
say right there somewhere above the eyes.
The war during the 420s is very, very complicated, with victories and defeats for both sides. The peace treaty that I mentioned that was signed in 421 was supposed to be for 50 years, but barely held at all, and conflict was open again within a very few years. In 415, the Athenians undertook a disastrous expedition against Sicily. This ended in 413 with the destruction of the Athenian naval fleet and the capture of their troops. In 411, a revolutionary oligarchic council of 400 took over the government of Athens. Democracy was restored in 410. The war itself finally ended in 404 when the Spartans defeated the Athenians. And under the terms of the peace treaty imposed on Athens by Sparta, a group of 30 men, generally referred to as the 30 tyrants, were chosen to govern Athens. They instituted a reign of terror. Some 1,500 citizens were executed and many others went into exile. Democracy was restored in 403. And thus, the years from 415 to 403 in particular were extremely chaotic ones for Athens, were very, very disruptive in all sorts of ways. And we'll come back to that point in the next couple of lectures when we talk about Aristophanes and about Plato. Now, this was the war which Thucydides, the second great historian, took as his subject matter. His history of the Peloponnesian War is our main source of information about the events of this war. Unfortunately, Thucydides' work is incomplete. It breaks off in the middle of a sentence in the midst of his description of the winter of 411. So we don't know if he died while writing that sentence, if something intervened and he was called away and never got back to it. But at any rate, the work breaks off in the middle of a sentence in the winter of 411. Most of our information about Thucydides himself comes directly from the histories. He was an Athenian. He served as a general in 424. We know that generals had to be at least 30 years old at the time of their service.
I'm going to say it's this ear right here.
Set Thucydides' birth date at no later than 454, probably a few years before that. He probably was a little bit older than the...
And that butts into the feet, possibly? No.
He caught the plague himself at some point between 430 and 427 and survived it. So his account of its symptoms is based not just on observation but on personal experience, and it's a pretty horrific account indeed. We know that he lived at least until the end of the Peloponnesian War. His account breaks off of the year 411, but obviously he couldn't quite keep up with writing his description on a day-to-day basis.
Hey, I got the plague.
We know that he lived at least until the end most of his writing must therefore have been done in exile, which makes us wonder how exactly he gathered the accurate information that he tells us he had. We don't know exactly when he died. The usual estimate is probably around 400. Now, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, Herodotus' presentation of the Persian Wars, the wars that had happened at the beginning of the 5th century BC, was undoubtedly colored in part by this same conflict between Athens and Sparta. But Thucydides chose to write about the Peloponnesian War itself, to take not events of a couple of generations back, but events of right now.
One of these has to be it. Where else do these go? Up here? Right here? No. Fucker. It's gotta go there. You would think. Or is that it? Yeah, it does, you dumbass. Alright, there's one leg on that side. Is that leg? Yeah.
According to many scholars' estimation. In his own presentation of his method and his introductory
So we need more of those little piece ones.
He's not aiming to please the ear of his listeners. He's not trying to write a fancy.
There we go. That's what we want.
But rather, he's trying to
we need this one and then that one. These are easy pieces if you can find them.
But Thucydides, nevertheless, owes a great deal to the example of Herodotus. The difference
What's this? We got a tip of something.
really more in manner of
We got a tip.
and method of approach than
Is that
in
green?
exclusion or inclusion of
Does that
material.
go right there?
In
Yes.
fact, Herodotus had set the course of later historiography in two primary ways. First, he recorded the events of the recent human past in detail. He did not just look at the remote legendary past as Homer had
There
done.
we go.
He
Something.
recorded the events of the recent human past in detail, and he paid attention to motivations and causes rather than
That means we got some blank space there, so that should help us find a piece.
of historiography. And also, Herodotus saw war as the most important of recent human events. Thucydides refined these aspects of Herodotus' historiography, but he did not set off in an entirely new direction. He's still talking about human events, their causes, and among those events, most particularly the causes of and course of a war. So Thucydides does not fundamentally alter the subject matter of this new genre. But despite the similarity of their subject matter, there are also some very significant differences of presentation and of approach in the works of these two great historians.
We got the black pieces
One
there.
of the most immediately noticeable differences is that Thucydides almost entirely omits any reference to the gods, fate, or the supernatural from his work.
What's this? It's
Now,
a piece of
At
blue.
the very end of the last lecture, Herodotus looks for human causes of events, but Herodotus also admits the gods,
Get
fate,
one more
and
in
the
there.
supernatural as pertinent sources of
About these.
explanation, not as sufficient sources of explanation. He doesn't just say this
Too
is
much.
the will of Zeus and leave it at that. He also looks for human causes, but Herodotus does at least admit that the gods, divine, fate, all of those things are possible sources of explanation. Thucydides tends to leave them out of account just about entirely and focus entirely instead on human motivations and actions. Now, it's important to understand that this distinction is, yet again, not one of leaving out references to stories that we would define as mythical. Thucydides, for instance, accepts that the Trojan War really happened. He mentions it in passing. He doesn't focus on it, but he accepts it as an event of the genuine human past. But while Herodotus will cite divine motivations as well as human ones, even for events in the very recent past, Thucydides gives only human rational motivations for occurrences even in the remote past. So Thucydides accepts the historicity of, say, the Trojan War, but when he talks about it in purely human, prosaic, everyday terms. Now, to some extent, this is a difference more in presentation than in methodology. Thucydides, just like Herodotus, relies on oral report, on the oral tradition, to a very great extent. Like Herodotus, he has no choice. There are not very many written documents for him to turn to. So just like Herodotus, Thucydides has to gather his information from oral informants. But since he's writing about much more recent events, he can also use his own eyewitness accounts, at least at some points. Both historians also rely heavily on their own sense of what is probable or what is important in their choice of which version of events to foreground. But Thucydides presents his work as a straightforward, objective reporting of facts, and his presentation is very compelling, very persuasive. It's very easy to believe that he really is a purely objective reporter just because he tells us so persuasively that he is. Now, another key difference lies in the two historians' stated motivations for writing. Each one wants to delineate the causes and the course of the war that he's taken as his main subject matter, the Persian War for Herodotus, the Peloponnesian War for Thucydides. But beyond that, beyond explaining the course of events and the causes of those events, Herodotus, as you'll remember from the last lecture, wants to memorialize the past, to keep the memory of great human achievements from becoming faded through the passage of time. While Thucydides suggests that his main motivation is so that the horrors of the present can provide insight into future events. He
Yes.
says, and I'm quoting here, "It will be enough for me if these
what's
words
this? The
of mine
nose?
are judged useful by those who want to understand clearly the
Well,
events
go
which
there.
happened in the past and which,
How's the
human
nose?
nature being what it is, will at some time or other and in much the same
That's the
ways
nose.
be repeated in the future. My work is not a piece of writing designed to meet the taste of an immediate public, but was done to last forever." In Greek, he says it's a ktema eis, a possession forever. Now, it's very interesting to me that Thucydides does not here say, "I'm writing to warn future people what happened to us so that they can avoid those things happening to them." He says he's giving them information. Human nature being what it is, these same events will at some time or other and in much the same ways be repeated in the future. So it's not a matter of saying, if you'll listen to me, you can avoid these catastrophes. It's more a matter of saying these same catastrophes are going to happen again. Here's how we dealt with them. Maybe that will help you figure your way through them.
You dumb bastards.
Thucydides says that he hopes his history will be useful or profitable to future people. He doesn't really
Please?
elaborate
Yes.
on what he means by that and what way it may be useful or
What's
profitable.
this?
But again, the difference in his focus and in Herodotus's is Herodotus wants to memorialize the past. Thucydides is
Well,
thinking
looks
more
like
in
it should
terms
go
of
about right there somewhere.
giving
There we
information
go.
for the future. But probably the most important essential difference, again, between the
hell's
two
this?
is that while Herodotus took the whole topic of East-West conflict from the earliest traceable accounts of it down to his own day as his subject, Thucydides set the focus of history on the very recent past or even on the present. That is, I think, the most crucial difference between the two writers. In effect, one could say that Thucydides isn't writing history at all. He's writing current events. He's writing an account of what happens in his own day. He tells us at the beginning of his work that he decided to write the history of the Peloponnesian War almost as soon as the war began, that he could tell that this was going to be an extraordinarily important war, and he took as his task a writing of, a chronicling of the events of that war almost as soon as it started. He didn't manage to keep absolutely abreast of events in his writing. How could he? But he didn't lag more than a very few years behind. As I say, we don't know exactly when he stopped writing. We know that he lived at least to the end of the war because he knew it lasted for 27 years. His work breaks off in 411. So there's a gap of at least 7 years there, maybe a little bit longer. By limiting the scope of his work to the Peloponnesian War and more importantly to events directly bearing on it, Thucydides does leave out many, many topics that Herodotus considered worth including. We don't find in Thucydides descriptions of the rise of Egypt or of Scythia or that sort of ethnographical, as it's often referred to, writing that we get in Herodotus, for instance. And in this regard in particular, Thucydides' influence on later historiography, both later Greek historiography and historiography in Western culture in general, was profound and I think clearly outweighed Herodotus' influence. If you think of how modern historians
Tis
write,
this.
very few of them are going to write a history that traces the causes of events all the way back to the mists of remote antiquity and carries it up on into our
Antler.
own day. We tend to focus more tightly on discrete events
Tail.
and the causes of those events.
Hell is it?
Most later Greek historians writing after Thucydides were mainly interested in the events of their own time, not of the remote past, and among these events,
That right there? I would say yes. So where's that foot? There we go. Hell yeah.
So that history almost became writing about
What's
war.
this?
And
Ear?
among other things, just to note in passing,
Kind of looks like an ear.
consequence of this is that in the Western historiographical tradition,
Big ear though, or the
focus of
tail.
history has been set really until the modern age,
Could it be
almost
this tail?
entirely on men and on
No.
masculine fields of endeavor. Women were excluded from politics and war, therefore women's doings did not figure in the writing of history. Now, Thucydides' influence on later historiography is also evident, and I think this is perhaps his most important influence, in the assumption of objective reporting that informs so much of Western culture's historiographical tradition. In fact, throughout most of the last 25
Right, we gotta find more of those old fragments. What's
have
this?
modeled their works on Thucydides' claim of factual reporting.
Pink.
Now, modern theoreticians of history very strongly question the possibility of objectivity and the possibility of purely disinterested reporting. In fact, I think
14th.
most modern theoreticians of history would say there cannot be any such thing. No one can be an objective reporter. No one can give just the facts without any bias. We all start from a viewpoint. We all start from a bias. And no matter how hard we try to be objective and to just list facts, we can't do that. The very writing of our view of those facts is in itself interpretation. So modern historiographical theory questions very much any claim of true objectivity. But I think that most readers of history would probably still agree that yes, with those caveats, with the recognition that no one can be a truly objective reporter, I think most readers of history would still agree that the historian's task is to try for that, to try to report as objectively as possible what actually happened, as objectively and accurately as possible. So we get this largely from Thucydides, this focus on objective reporting of accurate facts. And so what I'd like to do now is examine in some detail Thucydides' methodological statements, the bits of his work where he tells us how he approached his material, what he's trying to do with it, and where he gives this claim of objectivity. I'd like to look at those in some detail to see precisely what it is that he is claiming for his own objectivity and his own accuracy. Thucydides' clearest statement of his method occurs in Book 1, chapters 21 through 22, so quite early in his work. He tells us how he approached his material and what he tried to do with it. In this passage, Thucydides makes two main points about his approach to his material. He discusses the speeches that he includes throughout his
Should
text,
look for that
places
piece.
where he quotes in direct speech what someone said at some point or another in the war. And he describes how he arrived at the wording of those speeches. He also describes his reliance on eyewitness evidence for events, his own and others. I want to take those two statements in reverse
All right,
order.
there's a
What
part
he
of
says
an
about
antler.
eyewitness
Looks like a
evidence
heart.
is less difficult to interpret than what he says about the speeches. So we'll start with the less
Could be a
problematic
foot.
statement
No.
about eyewitnesses first. Thucydides' claim of objectivity, his statement that he is an objective
We already
reporter,
got those.
relies in large part on what he says about relying on eyewitnesses. He tells us that he did not assume the accuracy of
Let's see
whatever
over here.
some chance informant told him, of whatever story happened to come his way, but instead talked to as many eyewitnesses as he could find, compared their statements, and rather than just taking the first chance story he heard or relying on what seemed likely to him, he compared statements of eyewitnesses. He says that the events he describes are either ones where he himself was present or else he talked to people who were there. And he says, and I'm quoting, "And with regard to my factual reporting of the write down the first story that came my way, and not even to be guided by my own general impressions. Either I was present myself at the events which I have described, or else I heard of them from eyewitnesses whose reports I have checked with as much thoroughness as possible. Not that even so the truth was easy to discover. Both eyewitnesses give different accounts of the same events, speaking out of partiality for one side or the other, or else from imperfect memories. Now, as I say, that sounds very straightforward, very upfront. I talked to eyewitnesses, I compared their accounts. It was difficult to arrive at the truth, but I checked their accounts with as much accuracy as I could. His comment about relying on chance informants, or in this translation, the first story that came his way, is generally taken as a not very subtle dig at Herodotus. Thucydides here seems to be saying Herodotus would just write down whatever anybody told him. I didn't
Wait,
do
that's
that.
got a little pink on it.
I checked. I compared accounts.
Where is their little
And
pink?
Thucydides' own method of comparing eyewitnesses' reports at first glance
Over here?
seems to ensure accuracy.
Right there.
But then he himself immediately admits that informants disagree, either because they're partisan to one side or the other, or because their memories are faulty. They disagree. Admitting that this is a methodological problem, however, does not tell us how Thucydides solved that problem. He says, rather winningly, it was difficult because they disagreed with one another. He doesn't tell us what he relied on to sort out those disagreements. Majority, what the most eyewitnesses said, what seemed to him was likely, but he tells us he doesn't rely on that. So what
What's this?
did he use? He doesn't tell us. And his statement that
Is
he
that a color, or is
checked
that
facts with
just,
as much accuracy as possible
looks like a bit of a
doesn't tell
color.
us what he means by this. You notice he doesn't say how he checked the facts with as much accuracy as possible. In fact, despite his portrayal of himself as an objective reporter, Thucydides' own authorial control of which events to
Right there?
report is
No.
less transparent than Herodotus. Let me explain what I mean by that. Herodotus often tells us several different versions of stories, even when he considers the stories incredible. He will say, the people I was talking to told me this story. I find it unbelievable. Herodotus will say, quite frankly, up front, I find it unbelievable, but maybe others will believe it. In any case, here's what they told me. And he puts in what his informants told him. Herodotus very often will give 2 or 3 different versions of events and say, this is the one that seems most probable to me, but other people may disagree. So Herodotus relates, yes, chance stories happen to come his way, but by doing so, in effect, is exercising less authorial control over this material than Thucydides is. Thucydides omits
Why is
his
this
own
leg?
voice almost entirely.
That is an
He
eyeball.
doesn't say to us, now, I was told this version
I
of the
think.
story and this other version and yet a third version. I find the third one most credible, but here are the other 2, so you can judge by yourself. He simply
Is
says,
that eyeballs?
the story is, what happened is, and then gives us
We
whichever
got the
version
eyeballs
he
everywhere?
decided is most accurate.
No.
So if you
It's
think
his
about
eyeballs.
it, while this gives the appearance of objectivity, it does not necessarily by any means give it substance. And Herodotus, in effect, is perhaps the more objective historian
Okay, so what
because
is
he
this?
lays out the different versions of
Part of an eye, it looks like.
and not always, but
Yes.
often, and leaves it to his reader to sort out which one is most
This looks like
probable.
legs.
Now, even more problematic than Thucydides' apparently transparent statement of his reliance on eyewitness accounts is his description of how he composed the speeches in his history. There are a lot of speeches in Thucydides' account of the Peloponnesian War. Understandably enough, he's retelling political events that led to the war. He needs to tell us the speeches that the different politicians, the different speakers made. Here's what he says about how
Legs.
speeches in his history. He says,
I don't
quote,
think that's those legs.
in this history, I
Maybe
have
these
made
legs.
set speeches, some of which were delivered just before and others during the war.
Yes.
I have found it difficult to remember the precise words used in the speeches, which I listened to myself, and my various informants have experienced the same difficulty, which shouldn't surprise any of us if you're trying to remember the exact wording of a speech that someone gave 20 years ago. How well are you going to do it? And so he says it's difficult to remember the exact wording. So, my method has been, while keeping as closely as possible to the general sense of the words that were actually used, to make the speakers
Hey,
say
oh yeah.
what, in my opinion, was called for by each situation.
Yeah, buddy, lots of progress.
Precisely what Thucydides means in this sentence continues to be fiercely and hotly
Getting there.
debated between scholars. The more you read it, the more opaque
I think
it
once
becomes. There's
certain
several
things fall, other ones will go
He
quickly.
says that it was
Quickly.
difficult both for him and for his informants to remember with precision or exactness the Greek word.
Stay away from these legs.
Precision, to remember the exact wording of what the speech
All right,
is
where's
given
this
on
gonna
any
go?
occasion. And so he continues.
What is
He has
this?
written the speeches so
Obviously,
that
it's
the speaker said
antlers.
what in his opinion was appropriate or necessary on each occasion. The Greek here is ta deonta, the necessary or proper things. But he continues in the very next clause that he held as closely as possible to tes sympastes gnomes ton alethos lexenton, the overall sense of the things that were really
There?
said.
No.
Now, as has frequently been noted, the
Feels
two halves of
close.
the sentence contradict one another.
Feels
The Greek scholar and
close.
historian M.I. Finley sums the problem up well. He says, quote, "There is no way to get round the incompatibility of the two parts of that statement. If all the said what in Thucydides' opinion the situation called for, the remark becomes meaningless. But if they did not always say what was called for, then, insofar as Thucydides attributed such sentiments to them, he could not have been keeping as closely as possible to the general sense of the words used. It is also worth remembering that he never claimed to make generals, for example, conduct themselves in a manner called for by each situation as distinct from what they actually did." Close quote. The more one looks at this sentence, the harder it becomes to
There?
figure out precisely
Alright,
what
right.
Thucydides is claiming from these speeches. And believe me,
Right there.
a very great deal of scholarly ink
No.
is flowing to this problem. In fact, I myself wrote a PhD qualifying exam essay on this sentence of Thucydides. We
Aren't you just a special one?
But whatever Thucydides means to claim for his method of writing the speeches, there are two noteworthy points about the speeches themselves. First of all, they're all in Thucydides' own voice. He doesn't attempt at all to vary his style or
Give me these
characterization
legs
from one speaker
before I
to another.
lose my
And
mind.
this is true even when Thucydides includes speeches by some of the most famous speakers of his day. For instance, he is our source for the great funeral oration which Pericles gave in the first year of the war for the dead of Athens. Now, many of Thucydides' readers would surely have remembered that speech, but Thucydides doesn't seem, as far as we can tell, to try to mimic Pericles' own style. He may use a very few phrases when he says that Athens is a schoolhouse for the rest of Greece, for instance. That may be a phrase that Pericles actually
Alright,
used.
so that leg
But
goes
for the most
there.
part, Thucydides' Pericles
What leg would this be?
indistinguishable in style from any other speaker
Right
in
there,
his
you
work, and they
dumbass.
all sound
Right
like
there.
Thucydides. Now think for a moment just how peculiar that is. Suppose a modern writer of history were to include in direct quotation speeches by, let's say, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Ronald Reagan, and Rudolph Giuliani, and they all sound exactly alike. Anyone who had been around and had heard those different speakers would know something was wrong with that. But that's what Thucydides does. Second, the speeches are very, very frequent indeed in the history. So Thucydides' methodology in these speeches is a large part of his overall methodology. Some of the most important parts of the history, some of the most important factual narrative is presented as speeches or even as debates. For instance, the Mytilene debate in Book 3 of Thucydides' history presents arguments for and against executing and enslaving the entire population of Mytilene, which had rebelled against the Athenians.
Hey, we're gonna kill you all.
This cast as a debate between Cleon arguing for severe punishment and Diodotus arguing against it. Now, this very likely does reflect a genuine debate in Athens in 427, and one at which Thucydides may well have been present. So far, so good. But a very similar debate occurs in Book 5.
Some damn long legs there.
Dialogue, where the discussion is over whether or not the people of Melos should submit to a
Mimos?
rule. There it's cast as a debate not between two speakers. Rather, Thucydides puts in his text, the Athenians said, the Melians said. And it's very much the same form of debate as the one between Cleon and Diodotus in 427, but how can whole peoples debate with one another in direct speech? So the problem of accuracy in such a setting is formidable indeed. And the way we should
Formidable indeed.
in Thucydides' history
Is this his tail?
pause in our overall
No,
judgment
I've already
of
looked at
his
this, but that ain't his tail.
presentation of himself as an objective reporter.
Doesn't
To sum up,
go the right way. It might be his tail, actually.
to be an accurate and objective reporter of the
Wait,
facts that actually
that's
happened
not the
and
tail
ones
there,
that
you
either
dumbass.
weren't said or should
I'm thinking
have
of this
been
one's
said
tail.
becomes a bit more troubling the more we look at it. The more we look at his claims of accuracy, the more
No.
questions arise. And in
His
fact,
tail would be right there,
Thucydides'
and it's already
greatest
present.
triumph may well be in his convincing dramatic and literary portrayal of himself,
Anyway.
the historian, as an objective reporter of facts. So in this lecture, we have looked very briefly at the second great Greek historian, Thucydides. In the next lecture, we will return to Athenian drama and talk about the comic playwright Aristophanes.
All right, that's going to be it. I need a break. Oh. Hey, stop. Thank you. Whew, need a break.